He thought he had buried his past, but the past was about to cross right in front of him under a flickering red light in the middle of a cold Manhattan night, where rain tapped softly against the tinted windows of a black luxury sedan that smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, and inside sat Ethan Cole, a man who had built an empire out of silence and control, his hand resting calmly on the steering wheel while the city moved around him in blurred streaks of neon and shadow. His fiancée Victoria Hale beside him scrolling through her phone, her diamond ring catching the ambient glow from the dashboard as if it were a small captured star. Everything about this moment curated, controlled, perfect, until it wasn't, because just beyond the glass, under the harsh white glow of a pedestrian signal counting down from 10, there she was, Naomi Carter, soaked from the rain, her coat too thin for the weather, her hair clinging to her face in damp curls, and in each of her hands she held onto a child, two small boys no older than 3, their sneakers splashing through shallow puddles as they hurried across the crosswalk, their movements slightly unsteady but determined, and Ethan didn't breathe, not fully, not as his eyes locked onto her silhouette, because 3 years ago she had disappeared from his life without a word, leaving behind nothing but questions he had buried beneath layers of power and routine. And now she was here again, not alone, never alone. The shape of her world forever altered, and something in his chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years, a quiet fracture beneath the armor he wore so well. While the city kept moving, horns distant, tires hissing against wet pavement, and Naomi never looked up, not once, her gaze fixed ahead as if the man sitting just feet away behind darkened glass no longer existed in her universe, as if he had been erased the moment she chose to walk away. And beside him Victoria shifted slightly, her voice cutting through the silence with casual indifference as she glanced out the window and then away again, already bored, already dismissing the scene as background noise in a life that had never required her to notice people like that. And Ethan's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the wheel as the countdown reached 3, 2, 1, and the light changed, but he didn't move, not yet, because in that suspended second, as Naomi stepped onto the opposite curb and pulled the boys closer to her sides, one of them stumbling slightly before regaining his balance, he realized something he hadn't prepared for, something no amount of control could suppress. The past hadn't disappeared, it had simply been waiting for the right moment to return, and now it stood just beyond his reach, soaked in rain, holding 2 lives that might carry a truth he wasn't ready to face. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole hesitated. The light turned green, but the car behind them hesitated, as if even the city itself sensed something had shifted in the air, and Ethan finally eased his foot onto the gas, the engine responding with quiet precision as the sedan rolled forward. Yet his eyes lingered in the rearview mirror, watching Naomi's figure grow smaller with each passing second until she disappeared completely into the blur of rain and streetlights. And still he could not look away, not from the absence she left behind, not from the questions rising in his chest like something long suppressed finding oxygen again. While beside him Victoria exhaled softly, her tone casual but edged with something sharper, something that carried the quiet judgment of someone who had never needed to understand struggle. "You should not stop like that in the middle of the street," she said, adjusting the sleeve of her coat as if the moment had inconvenienced her. "People like that do not pay attention. It is dangerous." And Ethan nodded once, a minimal response, because explaining would mean acknowledging, and acknowledging would mean reopening something he had sealed years ago, something he had convinced himself no longer mattered. Yet the image refused to fade. Naomi's hands gripping those children, the way one of them had stumbled, the way she had not looked up even once, as if she had trained herself not to recognize him, as if seeing him would undo whatever fragile life she had built without him. And that realization settled heavily in his chest, because 3 years ago, when she disappeared, he had told himself she chose to leave, that she walked away from everything they had. But now, watching her move through the rain with 2 small boys who mirrored pieces of him in ways he could not yet define, the narrative he had lived by began to fracture, quietly but unmistakably, and the silence inside the car grew thicker, not uncomfortable but loaded, the kind that presses against your thoughts until they demand attention. And Victoria, sensing the shift but misreading its cause, reached for his hand, her fingers cool and deliberate, grounding in a way that was meant to reassure, yet it felt distant, almost foreign, because his mind was no longer inside the car. It was back at that crosswalk, replaying the moment frame by frame, searching for something he might have missed, a glance, a hesitation, anything that would explain why Naomi had vanished from his life and reappeared carrying a reality he had never been part of. And then, almost without thinking, he asked, his voice calm but quieter than before, "Did you see her face clearly?" And Victoria frowned, slightly, confused by the question. "No, why would I? She is just someone trying to get out of the rain," she replied, dismissive, already moving on. But Ethan did not respond, because to him she was not just someone. She was the one person who had once known him before the power, before the control, before the walls he built around himself. And now she had returned not with words, not with confrontation, but with silence and two children whose existence carried a weight he could not ignore. And as the car turned onto a quieter street lined with dim streetlights and empty sidewalks, Ethan made a decision he did not voice. Not yet. But it settled into him with certainty, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud. Because some questions do not fade with time, they wait. And tonight, those questions had found him again. By the time they reached the private drive of Ethan's high-rise building, the rain had softened into a steady whisper against the glass, the kind that blurred the edges of the world and made everything feel distant, almost unreal. Yet the image of Naomi remained sharp in his mind, unshaken by time or distance. And as the car came to a smooth stop beneath the covered entrance, a uniformed attendant stepped forward with practiced efficiency, opening Victoria's door first, offering a polite nod as she stepped out onto the dry pavement, her heels clicking softly against the concrete, a sound that belonged to a world of order and expectation, while Ethan remained seated for just a second longer than necessary, his hands still resting on the wheel, as if letting go meant accepting something he was not ready to face. Until finally he stepped out into the cool night air, the scent of rain lingering around him, grounding and sharp, and followed Victoria inside where warm lighting and polished marble floors welcomed them back into a life that was meant to feel secure, predictable, controlled. Yet something had shifted, and even the familiar space felt slightly off. Like a room where a conversation had just ended but the tension still remained in the air. And as they walked toward the elevator, Victoria slipped her arm through his, her voice lighter now, almost playful, speaking about dinner plans and upcoming events, about people they would see and expectations they would meet. But Ethan only half listened, nodding when appropriate, responding when required. His attention split between the present and a past that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. And when the elevator doors closed with a soft chime, sealing them inside a mirrored silence, he caught his reflection for a brief moment, the composed expression, the steady gaze, the image of a man who had everything under control, and for the first time in years, it felt incomplete, because control had not prepared him for what he saw tonight. It had not explained the children. It had not answered why Naomi had walked away without a word, and now returned carrying a life that seemed to exist entirely outside of his knowledge. And as the elevator ascended floor by floor, the quiet hum filling the space, a memory surfaced without permission, Naomi standing in a small kitchen years ago, sunlight coming through a narrow window, her laughter soft but certain, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, without fear, a version of him that existed before power defined him, before decisions carried consequences that reached beyond himself. And the contrast between that memory and the woman he saw tonight pressed against him with quiet force, because the Naomi he remembered would have looked at him. She would have said something, anything. But the Naomi at the crosswalk had chosen silence, and that silence carried meaning, the kind that does not need words to be understood. And when the elevator doors opened to the top floor, revealing the expansive hallway that led to his penthouse, Ethan stepped forward, but something inside him remained behind, still standing at that intersection, still watching her walk away. And as they entered the apartment, the lights adjusting automatically to their presence, Victoria moved ahead, already at ease, already at home, while Ethan paused just inside the doorway, his gaze distant for a fraction of a second before he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as if considering whether to act on the thought forming in his mind. Because once he started asking questions, there would be answers, and answers would change things permanently. And yet doing nothing was no longer an option, not after what he had seen, not after the realization that whatever story he had told himself about Naomi, leaving might not be the truth at all. And with a quiet exhale, he made the call, his voice low and controlled as always, giving a simple instruction to someone who did not ask questions, someone who understood that when Ethan Cole decided to look into something, it meant the past was no longer off limits. And as he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, the room remained silent. But the direction of his life had already begun to shift in a way he could not yet fully see. The night stretched quietly over the city, but inside Ethan's penthouse, time seemed to slow into something heavier, something deliberate, as if every second carried weight now, and long after Victoria had disappeared into the bedroom, her voice fading into a distant conversation on the phone. Ethan remained standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the skyline where thousands of lights flickered like distant signals, each one representing a life moving forward without hesitation, without questions. But his own thoughts refused to follow that same path, because somewhere beneath the surface of control he had spent years perfecting, something unsettled had begun to rise, and it did not ask for permission. It did not wait for the right moment. It simply existed, demanding attention. And as he loosened his tie slightly, the subtle shift in his posture revealing the tension he rarely allowed to show, his mind returned again to that crosswalk, to the way Naomi had held those children, not casually, not lightly, but with the kind of instinct that comes from protecting something that matters more than anything else. And that image refused to align with the version of her he had carried all these years, the one who left without explanation, without reason, leaving him to build a narrative that placed distance between what he felt and what he believed, because believing she chose to leave had been easier than questioning why she might have needed to. And yet now, standing here in a space defined by luxury and silence, that belief felt thinner, weaker, like a story that had been repeated too many times to remain unquestioned. And the soft vibration of his phone against the glass table behind him broke through the quiet, a single call, expected but still significant. And when he turned to answer, his expression returned to its usual calm, his voice steady, controlled, the same tone that had built empires and commanded respect. But there was something beneath it now, something sharper, something searching, and the man on the other end spoke with efficiency, relaying information without hesitation, without emotion, because that was the nature of the work. Details delivered cleanly, facts without interpretation, and Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze steady but distant as the pieces began to form a picture he had not anticipated, an address in a part of the city he had not visited in years, a modest building, small, practical, far removed from the world he now occupied. Employment records that painted a life of constant motion, multiple jobs, long hours, no support system noted. And then the detail that landed differently than the rest. The names of the two children, Liam and Noah Carter, ages 3, no listed father. And for a moment, there was silence. Not from the call, but from within him, a pause that did not need to be acknowledged out loud, because the implication was already there, clear without confirmation. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, asking only for the dates. And when those were given, aligning too closely with a time he remembered all too well, a time before everything changed, before she disappeared, before he convinced himself that some things were better left unanswered. He closed his eyes briefly, not in weakness, not in hesitation, but in recognition, because the truth does not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives with alignment, with patterns that cannot be ignored. And as the call ended and the room fell silent once more, Ethan remained still, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Yet for the first time, his world felt smaller, more focused, narrowed down to a single question he could no longer avoid. Not what happened, not why she left, but what he was going to do now that the past had returned, carrying more than just memory, carrying lives that might be tied to his in ways he had never considered. And as he opened his eyes again, the reflection staring back at him no longer looked like a man untouched by consequence. but like someone standing at the edge of a decision that would define everything that came next. Morning did not arrive gently for Ethan. It came with a quiet clarity that settled into his thoughts before the city even fully woke. The kind of clarity that does not bring peace but direction. And by the time the first light stretched across the skyline, he was already dressed, already moving through the routine that once grounded him, but now felt secondary to something else, something waiting just beyond the edges of his control. And as he stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee untouched in his hand, his gaze distant despite the view of the city below, the information from the night before replayed in precise detail, the address, the names, the absence of a father, all of it forming a pattern that no longer felt like coincidence. And yet what unsettled him was not just what he had learned, but what he had not done. Because at that crosswalk, in that moment when the past stood directly in front of him, he had chosen not to step out, not to call her name, not to break the silence that now seemed heavier than any answer could have been. And that realization stayed with him as he moved through the morning. Even as Victoria joined him, her presence composed, her voice light as she spoke about their plans for the day, about meetings and appearances, about a future that assumed certainty. And he responded as expected, calm, attentive, present in a way that concealed the shift happening beneath the surface. Because some decisions do not announce themselves, they unfold quietly, shaping actions before they are fully acknowledged. And when he finally left the penthouse, stepping into the controlled environment of his waiting car, the city already alive with movement, he did not give new instructions. He did not need to, because the destination had already settled in his mind. And as the car moved through familiar streets, past glass towers and polished storefronts that reflected a version of his life he had built carefully over time, the scenery began to change gradually, the edges softening, the structures older, less precise, the sidewalks more worn, and with each block, the distance between who he was and where he was going became more apparent, until finally the car slowed in front of a modest building that did not announce itself, that did not demand attention, but simply existed, practical, quiet, real in a way that contrasted everything he had left behind just minutes ago. And Ethan did not step out immediately, not because of hesitation, but because of recognition, because this was the space Naomi had chosen or perhaps been forced to build a life within, far removed from the world he once shared with her. And as he observed the building, the narrow entrance, the small windows, the subtle signs of everyday life that carried no excess, no illusion, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that whatever had happened 3 years ago had not led her towards something easier, but towards something harder, something that required endurance. And as he finally opened the car door and stepped onto the sidewalk, the air cooler here, less filtered, more immediate, he adjusted his coat slightly, his posture unchanged but his focus sharper, because this was no longer about speculation, no longer about distant questions. This was the moment where answers existed within reach. And as he walked toward the entrance, each step measured but certain, the weight of what he might discover no longer something he could delay. He realized that the silence between them had lasted long enough, and whether she was ready or not, whether he was ready or not, that silence was about to end. The hallway inside the building was narrow and quiet, the kind of silence that did not come from design but from routine, from people moving through their lives without needing to be seen. And as Ethan stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, the sound echoed just enough to remind him how different this place was from the world he came from. No polished marble, no controlled lighting, just worn flooring, faint traces of footsteps, and the distant hum of a television from somewhere above. And for a moment, he stood still, not uncertain, but aware, because this was not his environment, not a space where his presence commanded attention. Here he was simply a man walking into a building with questions, and as he moved toward the stairwell, instead of waiting for the slow elevator, each step upward carried a steady rhythm that matched the pace of his thoughts, controlled on the surface, but shifting beneath. Because with every floor he climbed, the distance between speculation and reality grew smaller, and when he reached the 3rd floor, the number he had been given, he slowed slightly, not from hesitation but from focus, his eyes scanning the narrow hallway until they settled on a door that looked like every other door except for one detail. A small pair of children's shoes placed neatly to the side, damp from the morning. And something about that simple detail grounded the entire situation in a way no report ever could, because it was real, lived, present. And as he stood there, just a few feet away, he could hear faint movement inside, the soft sound of something being set down, a quiet voice, not clear enough to understand, but unmistakably hers. And for the first time since stepping out of his car, Ethan paused, not because he did not know what to do, but because this moment, the one right before everything changes, does not repeat itself, and once the door opens, once words are spoken, there is no returning to the version of the past that existed before. And so he let that second exist fully, his hand resting near the door, but not yet raised, his breath steady, his posture unchanged, and then he knocked, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to be heard. A simple action that carried more weight than anything he had done the night before. And inside, the movement stopped, the quiet shifting into something more alert, more aware, and a few seconds passed, long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be avoidance, before footsteps approached, light but measured, and when the door finally opened, it was not wide, just enough for Naomi to stand there, framed by the space behind her, her expression still, her eyes meeting his without surprise, without confusion, as if some part of her had expected this moment, even if she had not wanted it, and neither of them spoke at first, because sometimes recognition does not need confirmation. It exists in the way two people look at each other after time has changed everything except what remains unspoken, and Ethan took in the details he had only glimpsed before, the fatigue she carried but did not show openly, the strength in the way she stood, the quiet control in her silence, and behind her, just visible past her shoulder, two small figures moved across the room, their presence undeniable now, not imagined, not assumed, but real, and in that moment, standing at the threshold of a life he had not been part of, Ethan understood something clearly. This was not about finding answers anymore. This was about facing them, and Naomi, without stepping aside, without inviting him in, spoke first, her voice calm but firm, carrying no anger yet no warmth either, just truth held steady over time. You should not be here, and the space between them held the weight of everything that had never been said. The words settled between them without echo, quiet but immovable, and Ethan did not step back, did not argue immediately, because something in Naomi's tone made it clear that this was not a moment for force or authority. This was a boundary she had built carefully over time, one that had held long before he arrived, and would not break simply because he was standing in front of it now. And so instead, he met her gaze fully, not with the distance he once used to protect himself, but with a steadiness that acknowledged what stood between them. I saw you last night, he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying no accusation, only fact, and Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, a recognition of inevitability rather than surprise, because this was never a question of if he would come, only when. And behind her, one of the boys laughed softly at something unseen, the sound light and unaware, cutting through the tension in a way that made the moment feel even sharper by contrast. And Ethan's gaze moved briefly past her, just enough to confirm what he already knew. Two small lives moving freely in a space that was entirely theirs, untouched by the world he came from. And when his eyes returned to Naomi, the question that had followed him here no longer needed to be softened. How long were you planning to keep this from me? He asked, not raised in anger, but grounded in something deeper, something that came from the realization that time had already been taken from him without his knowledge. And Naomi exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of restraint, because there were answers she had carried alone for years, answers that had never been meant to be shared, and yet here they were, standing at the edge of them. And for a moment, she glanced back over her shoulder, checking on the boys, ensuring they were still occupied, still unaware, before stepping slightly into the doorway, not inviting him in, but not closing it either, creating a space where truth could exist without fully collapsing the distance she had built. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, controlled, shaped by time and experience rather than emotion. I did not keep anything from you, she said, quietly, and Ethan's brow tightened just enough to show the flaw in that statement. But before he could respond, she continued, not allowing interruption. You made it very clear what your world required, what it demanded, and I made a choice based on that. And the words landed differently than he expected, not defensive, not apologetic, but factual, as if the past had been decided in a moment he had not fully understood at the time. And Ethan took a small step forward, not enough to cross the threshold, but enough to close the space between them slightly, his voice lower now, more personal. A choice that did not include telling me I had children. And for the first time, Naomi's composure shifted, not breaking, but revealing something beneath it, not guilt, not regret, but something heavier, something that had been carried alone for too long, and she met his gaze directly, no longer avoiding the weight of what stood between them. A choice that kept them safe, she replied, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than any explanation could have, because it reframed everything, not as absence, not as betrayal, but as protection. And in that moment, Ethan understood that this was not just about what he had lost. It was about what she had prevented, what she had shielded from a world he knew too well, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the realization that the past had not been abandoned. It had been redirected, and now it stood in front of him, asking not for explanation, but for understanding he was not yet sure he knew how to give. The air between them shifted, not with raised voices or sudden movement, but with the quiet weight of something finally being seen for what it was. And Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because what she had said changed the ground beneath the conversation, turning accusation into something more complex, something that required him to look beyond himself, beyond what he felt he had been denied, and into what she had chosen to protect. And as his gaze lowered briefly, then returned to her, the controlled certainty he carried so easily in every other part of his life seemed to falter just enough to reveal something more human, more uncertain, because for the first time, the question was no longer why she left, but what she had been shielding them from. And Naomi watched him carefully, not with expectation, but with awareness, as if she had already lived through every version of this moment in her mind and knew that no explanation would be simple. And behind her, one of the boys moved closer, small footsteps crossing the floor until he appeared at her side, his hand reaching instinctively for her sleeve, his eyes lifting toward Ethan with quiet curiosity, not fear, not recognition, just the natural openness of a child encountering someone new. And the simplicity of that gaze struck Ethan more deeply than anything that had been said, because there was no history in it, no judgment, just a question waiting to be formed. And Naomi gently rested her hand over the boy's, grounding him, her posture shifting slightly, protective but not defensive. And when she spoke again, her voice softened just enough to acknowledge the presence beside her. You should go, she said, not harshly, but firmly, because whatever needed to be understood could not happen like this, not at the threshold, not with the past standing too close to the present. And Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his eyes moving between Naomi and the child beside her. The resemblance subtle but undeniable in ways that did not need to be explained, and something inside him, something that had been built on control and distance, began to give way to a different kind of awareness, one that did not come from power but from presence, from the realization that these were not just answers to questions he had carried. They were lives that had existed without him, grown without him, shaped by choices he had never been part of. And as the second boy appeared behind the first, peeking from the doorway with the same quiet curiosity, the scene settled into something undeniable, something that could not be undone or ignored. And Ethan finally took a step back, not in retreat, but in recognition of the boundaries she had drawn, because pushing forward now would not bring clarity. It would only break something that had been carefully held together. And as he did, Naomi's shoulders relaxed just slightly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement that he had understood at least that much. And the silence that followed was no longer empty. It carried the weight of everything that had been revealed without being fully spoken. And before turning away, Ethan looked at her one last time, not searching, not questioning, but seeing her as she was now, not the memory he had held on to, not the absence he had resented, but the woman who had made choices he was only beginning to understand. And without another word, He stepped back into the hallway, the door closing softly between them, not as an ending, but as a pause, a moment where everything had shifted and nothing could return to what it was before. The hallway felt quieter after the door closed, not because the building itself had changed, but because something inside Ethan had, and as he stood there for a brief moment, the echo of that soft click settling into the space around him, he did not move immediately, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because for the first time in years, he was standing without control over what came next, without the ability to command an outcome or shape a situation to his advantage, and that realization did not weaken him. It grounded him in a way that was unfamiliar yet undeniable, and as he finally turned and walked back toward the stairwell, his steps steady but slower than before, the weight of what he had seen and heard no longer something he could separate from himself. The narrow hallway, the worn floor, the quiet life behind that door all remained vivid in his mind, not as distant observations, but as truths he now carried with him. And when he stepped back out onto the street, the air felt different, not colder, not warmer, just clearer, as if the city had shifted into sharper focus. And for a moment, he looked up at the building again, not searching for her, not expecting the door to open, but acknowledging that everything he thought he understood about the past had been incomplete, and that the answers he had once believed he deserved were never the full story, because what Naomi had done was not absence, it was protection, not silence, but sacrifice, and that understanding did not come with immediate resolution, it came with responsibility, the kind that could not be ignored or postponed. And as his car pulled up beside him, the driver stepping out and opening the door, Ethan paused just long enough to take one final look at the place where his life had quietly divided into before and after, and then he stepped inside, not as the man who had arrived earlier seeking answers, but as someone who now carried them, even if they were incomplete. And as the car moved back into the flow of the city, past familiar streets that no longer felt quite the same, his phone buzzed softly in his pocket, a message from Victoria, simple, casual, asking when he would be back, a reminder of the life waiting for him, the expectations, the future that had already been set in motion. And for the first time, he did not respond immediately, not because he was avoiding it, but because the question itself now held more weight than it once did, because returning would mean continuing a path that no longer existed in isolation. It would mean moving forward while knowing that part of his life had been left behind, not by choice, but by circumstance, and that part was no longer hidden, no longer distant, but real, living, waiting. And as the city passed by outside the window, reflections shifting across the glass, Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady but thoughtful, and in that quiet space between action and decision, he understood something that could not be undone. That power had never been the measure of his life, not truly, because in one moment, at a crosswalk he almost ignored, everything had changed, not through force, not through conflict, but through truth, simple and undeniable. And now, whatever came next would not be defined by what he controlled, but by what he chose to face. And that choice, unlike any before it, would determine not just who he was, but who he was willing to become. And that day, without announcement or spectacle, the most powerful man in the city finally understood what it meant to stand in front of something he could not command, only respect.